The station had no sun to orbit. It sat in the cold dark between star systems, a massive ring of metal and glass that turned slowly on its own axis to fake gravity for the hundreds of species who walked its floors. The name on every galactic map was Concordia Prime. In every language spoken among the stars, the name meant the same thing: neutral ground. It had been built 600 years ago, when the oldest spacefaring civilizations decided that talking was better than fighting. They built Concordia Prime as a place where no weapons were allowed, where no single species held control, and where every member of the Galactic Assembly of Civilizations could send their people to speak and be heard. 600 years of meetings. 600 years of arguments, agreements, treaties, and quiet arrangements. The station had seen all of it. Ambassador Yara Osai had seen none of it. She had been assigned to Concordia Prime 11 months ago, fresh from Earth's foreign service, carrying a small bag of personal items and a large file of briefing documents she had read 3 times on the journey out. She was 42 years old, calm by nature, and very hard to surprise. She had grown up in Accra, studied law in London, and spent 15 years managing the most difficult diplomatic situations Earth could put in front of her. She thought she had seen difficult. Concordia Prime taught her she had not. The main assembly hall was a circle. That was the first thing people noticed. A perfect circle, 500 meters across, with tiered seating that rose up in rings from the central floor like the inside of a bowl. The floor was where the delegates sat, 1 table per species, arranged in a pattern that had been argued over for 2 centuries before anyone agreed on it. The tiers above were for observers, aides, journalists, and the representatives of species too small or too new to hold a full seat at the floor tables. The ceiling was transparent, and the dead star the station orbited was a faint red smudge at the top of the sky, visible only if you knew to look for it. Humanity's table was small. That was not unusual for newer members. The table held 4 chairs, and this morning 3 of them were filled. Yara sat in the center. To her left was Kofi, her senior aide, a quiet man with a good memory and the ability to read body language in 14 alien species. To her right was Dr. Ananya Rao, their science and technical advisor, who had spent 20 years studying null veil physics before anyone in the assembly had been willing to share data with Earth about it. The 4th chair was empty. It was always empty. Earth had never had enough standing in the assembly to fill it. The hall was full. That was the second thing Yara noticed when she walked in that morning. Usually half the observer tiers were empty. Today every seat was taken. She counted at least 30 species she could identify from their physical shapes, and many more she could not. Word had spread that something was being voted on today. Word always spread when something affected the outer arm. The outer arm was a long stretch of space at the edge of the galaxy, far from the old core civilizations, where the stars were younger and the planets less picked over. Humanity had been building colonies there for 40 years, slow work done with generation ships and careful terraforming, and a great deal of stubbornness. 12 of those colonies were now home to more than 1 billion people. They grew food, mined metals, built ships, and sent back resources that kept Earth's growing population fed and housed. They were not easy to build, and they were not easy to maintain, and every single one of them mattered. The resolution on the floor today had a long official name. In plain speech, it meant one thing: stop the humans from expanding in the outer arm. Yara had read the full text 3 times. She had asked Kofi to read it and tell her if she had missed anything. She had not missed anything. The resolution, tabled by the Veth hegemony, declared a large section of the outer arm a restricted expansion zone. Any new colony construction in that zone would require assembly approval, a process that took between 8 and 20 years under normal conditions. The existing colonies could stay. But they could not grow, could not build new settlements, and could not expand their infrastructure beyond current levels without going through a committee that had never once, in its history, approved a request from a species that had been a member for fewer than 50 years. Humanity had been a member for 11. The Veth hegemony was old. They had been traveling between stars for 4,000 years, which made them middle-aged by assembly standards but ancient by anyone else's. They controlled trade routes through the core of the galaxy with the quiet confidence of people who had never had to fight for what they had. Their senior delegate to the assembly was a being called Counselor Rethais, tall and thin-limbed, with pale gold skin and eyes the color of deep water. Rethais had been doing this work for 200 years. He found humans mildly irritating in the way that a person who has kept a tidy garden for a lifetime finds a neighbor who plants things in the wrong places. Rethais had not looked at the human table once since the session opened. Yara noticed. She noticed everything. The procedural opening took 40 minutes. The assembly speaker, a gray-shelled being called Orvith who moved slowly and spoke precisely, walked through the agenda items in order. There were 4 votes scheduled for the day. The outer arm resolution was third. Yara sat straight in her chair and kept her expression neutral and listened to every word. Kofi took notes. Dr. Rao reviewed technical files on a small screen. In the observer tiers above, journalists from 17 species watched their feeds. Some of them pointed cameras at the human table. Humans were, from the perspective of most of the galaxy, interesting in the way that new things are interesting before you understand them fully. The assembly had admitted 3 new species in the past century. Humanity was the only one that had arrived with colonies already established across an unexplored frontier. That was unusual. That made some species curious and made other species nervous. The Veth had decided the correct response was to stop them where they were. Yara picked up her water glass. It was filled with plain water, slightly cold, the same thing she drank every morning at her desk at home. She had brought the habit with her across 30 light years. She took a slow sip and set the glass down and looked at the ceiling, at the faint red smear of the dead star above them all. Then she looked at the Veth table, at the back of Counselor Rethais's long pale head, and at the 8 other Veth delegates arranged around him like a wall. Kofi leaned close to her ear. "Head count on the vote is done," he said quietly. "They have it. 160 confirmed. They need 140. Yara nodded once. She already knew. She had done her own count the night before. She picked up her water glass again and waited. Outside, in the long dark of the outer arm, 1 billion people were growing food, building homes, raising children, and watching the same stars they had been watching since before they had ships to reach them. None of them knew what was being decided today. None of them had been asked. That was the part that sat in Yara Osai's chest like a stone. Not the politics, not the vote count. Just the plain fact of 1 billion people going about their lives while a room full of strangers decided how small those lives were allowed to be. She set her glass down. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. The debate opened at the 2nd hour of the session, after 2 smaller procedural votes had been settled quickly and without argument. The speaker called the outer arm resolution to the floor and the hall shifted. Delegates straightened in their seats. The observer tiers went quiet. Even the ventilation systems seemed to hold their breath. Counselor Rethais of the Veth hegemony was the first to speak. He rose from his chair with the careful ease of someone who had stood before this room so many times that standing felt like sitting. He adjusted his outer robe, a deep blue fabric that caught the light in a way that had no doubt been chosen deliberately, and he began. His voice was smooth and unhurried. He spoke for 12 minutes. In those 12 minutes, he used the word stability 7 times, balance 6 times, and orderly development 4 times. He never once used the word human. When referring to Earth's colonies, he called them the frontier settlements of the recently admitted species, a phrase so long and neutral that it barely seemed to refer to real places where real people lived. His argument was simple. The outer arm trade corridors, used by a dozen species for centuries, were being disrupted by the rapid and uncoordinated expansion of new infrastructure. New colonies required shipping routes. New shipping routes overlapped with existing ones. The result was what Rethais called friction, and what any reasonable person would call minor inconvenience, but which the Veth hegemony, whose trade profits depended on undisturbed corridor access, found to be deeply significant. The solution, Rethais said, was not punitive. It was simply prudent. A defined zone, clear limits, a framework for any future expansion requests, all very reasonable, all very calm. He sat down, without looking at the human table. 3 more speakers followed. An elder representative from the Gorath Confederation, a species whose territory bordered the outer arm on its northern edge, spoke about the disruption to long-established migration patterns of automated cargo ships. A delegate from the Parish Collective cited 2 minor incidents in which human construction vessels had entered space the parish considered traditionally theirs, despite it appearing on no official map as such. A third voice, from a species Yara did not recognize from their physical form alone, spoke in very academic language about the theoretical risks of unregulated expansion in regions with uncharted phenomena. The uncharted phenomena they meant was the null veil. Yara watched Ananya Rao's jaw tighten slightly when that speaker sat down, just slightly, just enough that Yara noticed. The speaker called for responses from affected parties. Yara stood. She had 3 minutes. The speaker had been very clear about that. 3 minutes, measured against a timer that was visible to the entire hall. She did not thank the previous speakers. She did not open with pleasantries. She picked up a single printed sheet from the table in front of her, looked at it once as though confirming something she already knew, and set it down. She began. The 12 outer arm colonies currently operating under Earth's administration support a combined population of 1,240,000,000 people, she said. Her voice was not loud. She had learned long ago that speaking quietly in a large room made people lean in. Over the past 8 years, those colonies have produced and exported to assembly member worlds the following: 412 million metric tons of processed grain and protein product, 60 billion units of rare earth compounds used in faster-than-light drive components, 17 active medical research collaborations with 7 member species, 2 of which are currently in the final stages of producing treatments for conditions that affect populations across the Sarathi home worlds. She paused, not for drama, to let the numbers land. All data-sharing agreements that enabled those collaborations were proposed by Earth. All infrastructure costs for the shipping corridors connecting the outer arm to core assembly space were partially funded by Earth. The early warning sensor network currently providing the assembly's only real-time monitoring of null veil expansion was built by Earth, is maintained by Earth, and has provided 14 advance alerts to border species in the past 3 years alone. The hall was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant people were doing calculations. The restricted expansion zone as proposed would place 9 of our 12 operating colonies inside its boundaries. It would prevent the construction of 3 planned agricultural settlements that are already under contract to supply food product to Durnai border worlds, whose own harvests have been failing for 6 consecutive growing cycles. She looked up at the observer tiers. She looked at the press cameras. She looked at the Sarathi delegate, a being who sat very still and whose species shared a border with the null veil. "We are not asking for special treatment," Yara said. "We are asking the Assembly to look at what is actually happening in the outer arm before deciding what should stop." She had 40 seconds left. It was Councillor Rethais who took them from her. He did not raise his hand. He did not request the floor. He simply spoke, loudly enough to carry across the hall, in the tone of a person who had never once in 200 years been interrupted himself. "The delegate from Earth has presented statistics," he said. "Statistics are not the same as standing. A species that has been part of this assembly for 11 years has not yet earned the right to inconvenience the rest of the galaxy with its ambitions." He did not shout. He did not sneer. He said it the way a person says a fact, The way you say the sky is dark or the star is old. There was a sound from the observer tiers. Not laughter exactly. More like the sound of a crowd that has just seen something they found amusing and are deciding whether to show it. Yara's 3 minutes ended. The timer beeped once. She did not sit down immediately. She stood behind her chair and looked at the room. Not at Rethai's, at all of it. The curved rows of delegates, the tiered galleries, the cameras, the speaker who was looking at his notes, the Sarathi delegate who was looking at her, the empty fourth chair at her own table. She put her hand on the back of her chair. She picked up her printed sheet. She placed it inside her folder. She closed the folder. Then she looked at Kofi and at Ananya Rao, and something passed between the three of them that required no words at all, because they had worked together for 3 years and had spoken without words before. Kofi began closing his notebooks. Ananya began shutting down her screen. Yara Osa pushed her chair back from the table, slowly, quietly. The legs made a soft sound against the floor. In the observer tiers, a camera swiveled toward her. She stood up straight. She straightened her jacket, and she waited just one more moment to see if anyone in that great circular room would speak. Nobody did. She walked to the center of the floor. That was not where people went when they left a session. People left from the sides, through the outer doors, down the corridors that led back to delegation suites and transport bays. The center of the floor was the speaker's space. Walking to it was not done. Yara walked to it. She stopped at a point roughly equidistant from every table in the room. The assembly hall was perfectly circular, and from where she stood, 341 delegations were arranged around her in an equal ring. She could see all of them and they could see her. The speaker said her name, a question in it. She spoke clearly, without raising her voice, the way she had learned to speak in rooms where acoustics were designed to carry sound. The delegation of Earth withdraws its support for this session's proceedings, she said. A sound moved through the hall, not a gasp, more like a shift, the sound of a very large number of beings adjusting their weight at the same moment. Effective immediately and pending full diplomatic review, Earth suspends participation in all joint scientific data sharing agreements currently active under Assembly framework. This includes the Null Veil Sensor Network Monitoring Protocols, the Faster-than-Light Routing Contribution Database, and the 17 active medical research partnerships currently in collaborative phase. She let that sit for 2 seconds. We will communicate further through official channels. She turned and walked to the door. Kofi and Ananya were already behind her. They had moved while she spoke, gathering their materials, standing, walking to fall in step behind her. The three of them crossed the floor together. No one spoke. Every camera in the room was pointed at them. Every delegate watched. The main doors of the assembly hall were large. They were designed to be large, built for the bodies of species much bigger than humans. They opened inward and they were heavy, and when Yara pushed through them, they swung slowly, and when they swung back behind the three of them, they closed with a sound that filled the hall. A deep, resonant boom that lasted 3 seconds in the room's careful acoustics. And then silence. Councillor Rethais of the Veth hegemony sat very still. He had been in this hall for 200 years. He had seen arguments and protests, and even once, a long time ago, a physical altercation between 2 delegates who had since reconciled and become trade partners. He had never seen anyone walk out of a full session. Not once. Not in 600 years of assembly history. The speaker said something procedural. His voice cracked slightly on the first word. At the Sarathi table, a delegate named Tevari pulled up a secondary screen and began entering search terms. She was looking for the Null Veil Sensor Network Agreement. She found it in 30 seconds and read the terms with the focus of someone who has just realized they should have read something much sooner. The sensor network ran along 800 light-years of the Null Veil's known boundary. It consisted of 412 individual detection nodes, all of them built, launched, and maintained by human engineering teams operating out of the outer arm colonies. The data it produced was transmitted freely to any assembly member who requested it. Most had not bothered to set up their own feeds because the human feed was already there and already accurate and already free. If the feed went dark, the closest species to the veil would have no advance warning of expansion events. The Sarathi had 2 populated systems within 3 light-years of the veil's mapped edge. Tevari looked at her colleague across the table. Her colleague was looking at the same numbers. In the observer tiers, a journalist from the Terran press service was already transmitting. The story was simple to write. It would read very differently on different worlds. On Veth worlds, it would read as an outburst from an immature species that had embarrassed itself. On Sarathi worlds, it would read differently. On the smaller species worlds, the ones that had always sat in the upper tiers and watched the elder civilizations run the floor, it would read differently still. Rethais turned to his senior aide. "They will return within the hour," he said. "This is theater." His aide, who had been doing her own calculations for the past 3 minutes, did not answer immediately. "Counselor," she said carefully, "the FTL routing data." "What about it?" Earth's contribution to the routing database represents 41% of the outer arm corridor data. If they pull it, the navigational accuracy for the Veth Corridor 7 shipping lanes drops by an estimated 30%. The margin of error on fold jumps in that region increases from 0.4% to approximately 3%. Rethais was quiet for a moment. "A 3% fold jump error rate," his aide continued, "means roughly 1 in 33 cargo vessels will experience a navigation deviation significant enough to require course correction. In terms of our current shipping volume through Corridor 7, that represents 11 vessels per standard month." Rethais said nothing. "And those are just the routes where their data is primary," his aide said. "In the routes where it's supplementary, the degradation is less severe, but across all Veth commercial traffic." "I understand mathematics," Rethais said. The aide stopped talking. Rethais looked at the doors. The heavy doors that had swung shut 3 minutes ago and had not opened since. He looked at them for a long time. In the upper tier, the camera drones of 20 news services were still pointed at those same doors. Elsewhere in the hall, delegates were talking quietly to their aides. Screens were being opened. Numbers were being looked at for the first time by people who had never thought they needed to look at them. The Terran delegate was on a direct line to his home government. The 3 species whose medical research partnerships were now suspended were reading the terms of those partnerships and discovering, slowly, exactly how much of the work Earth had been doing, and how much of their own team's progress depended on data that was no longer going to arrive. The speaker called for a recess. Nobody moved for almost 30 seconds. Then gradually, the hall began to stir. Slowly. The way things move when the ground has shifted and everyone is deciding whether the thing they were standing on is still solid. Outside the hall, in Corridor 7 of Concordia Prime's delegation wing, Yara Osai walked at a steady pace toward the human delegation's transport bay. Kofi walked beside her. Ananya walked on her other side. None of them spoke. The corridor was long and the lights were steady and the station turned slowly in the dark outside the viewports, and in the distance, invisible and unmeasured without humanity's sensors watching it, the null veil drifted. On the first day, nobody believed it was real. The official communication from Earth's delegation was short and written in plain language. It confirmed the suspension of the data-sharing agreements. It listed which agreements specifically. It gave a contact address for formal diplomatic inquiries, and noted that all such inquiries would be reviewed in order of receipt. The tone was the tone of an organization that had decided something calmly and was not interested in arguing about it. It read like a locked door. The Assembly's response was immediate and confident. The Veth hegemony's chief diplomatic officer issued a statement that same evening calling the walkout a procedural irregularity and assuring all concerned parties that the situation would be resolved within standard session time. 3 other species issued similar statements. The consensus among the elder civilizations was that this was the behavior of a young species that had been embarrassed and would, after a brief expression of emotion, return to the table and behave correctly. That was the first day. On the second day, the FTL routing data began to degrade. It was not dramatic. There were no alarms. Ships did not suddenly begin crashing into each other. The change was subtle and mathematical. The navigational calculation systems across 12 assembly member fleets began returning slightly higher uncertainty values on their fold jump plots for the outer arm corridors. Most navigators adjusted their safety margins automatically. This meant slightly longer travel times, slightly less fuel efficiency, and a small but measurable increase in the cost of every journey through those lanes. The Veth hegemony's logistics division sent a priority report to Rethais. He read it. He issued no public statement. On the second day also, the null veil monitoring feed went to a reduced update cycle. Earth's sensor network was still running. Nobody had ordered it shut down. But without active cooperation from the assembly data sharing framework, the network's automated systems dropped to their default standalone mode, which transmitted alerts every 6 hours instead of every 40 minutes. It was a technical adjustment, not a deliberate act. Earth's team on Concordia Prime had simply stopped manually overriding the default settings, because they were not sure what their status was, and their instructions said to hold and wait. Tevari of the Sarathi delegation noticed the change in the update cycle at 300 station time. She stayed awake for the rest of the night reading old reports. On the third day, 6 smaller species that sat in the outer rings of the assembly floor issued a joint public statement. It was 3 paragraphs long. It noted that Earth's contribution to assembly infrastructure was, upon review, more significant than previously appreciated. It expressed support for a reconsideration of the outer arm resolution. It stopped well short of calling out the Veth directly, but it did not have to. Everyone who read it knew what it meant. On the 4th day, the Sarathi delegation formally withdrew their support for the resolution. Rethais received the news in his suite. His aide read him the statement. He sat with his long hands folded on the table in front of him and looked at a spot on the wall. "They will reconsider," he said. "The Dern have also signaled they are reviewing their position," his aide said. Quietly, not publicly yet. Rethais said nothing. "The issue is the food contracts," his aide continued. "The 3 agricultural settlements that the resolution would block are under contract to supply the Dernai border worlds. The Dernai border worlds have had 6 bad harvests, if those settlements are not built. I know what the contracts say. The Dernai government is calculating what it would cost to find alternative suppliers. There are no current alternative suppliers in range with sufficient production capacity." Rethais stood up and walked to the viewport. Outside was the dark and the far smear of the dead star and the slow rotation of the station's outer ring. Somewhere past all of that, in directions he knew on maps but had never traveled, 1 billion humans were doing things he had not properly looked at in 11 years. That was the thing that was settling in him like a slow weight, not the anger, not the inconvenience, the simple fact that he had not looked. He had seen numbers in reports and had processed them as minor and had not looked at the actual shape of what 11 years of human work in the outer arm had quietly become. 41% of the corridor routing data, 14 null veil alerts in 3 years, 17 medical research partnerships, 3 food contracts for failing worlds. Not conquests, not threats, just work, steady, persistent. Unremarkable work done by a species that had been told it was too young to matter and had gone ahead and mattered anyway. On the 5th day, an anomaly was detected along the null veil's eastern boundary. It was a small expansion pulse, the kind that happened 6 or 7 times a year, a brief outward pressure where the veil's undefined edge pushed a few light hours further into mapped space, and then usually settled. The normal protocol was to alert border species within 40 minutes so they could check on any assets in the affected zone. The alert went out 6 hours later. It was still early enough to matter for most of what lay in the zone, but the Sarathi had 2 automated relay stations in the area that operated on a 45-minute response window. Both were lost, not destroyed, just folded into the veil's expanded boundary, which meant they were gone in a way that nobody fully understood and that nobody was comfortable thinking about too carefully. The loss of 2 relay stations was not a catastrophe, it was a cost. Tevari submitted a report to the Assembly Directorate. She wrote it in precise language, and she did not mention the suspended censor agreement directly. She did not have to. The timing was in the numbers for anyone who read carefully. On the 6th day, the Terran delegation withdrew their support for the resolution. They issued no public statement. They simply sent a formal note to the Speaker's office and said nothing to the press. On the 7th day, Rethais sent a private communication to the human delegation's contact address. It was carefully worded. It expressed a desire for dialogue. It did not concede anything specifically, but it was the kind of message that, in the language of diplomacy, meant the person who sent it was ready to talk. It was not answered. On the 8th day, the Assembly's Archival and Records Division circulated an internal document that had been requested by 11 different delegations simultaneously. The document was a full accounting of Earth's contributions to shared assembly infrastructure since joining 11 years ago. It had never been compiled as a single document before. There had been no reason to compile it. Earth's contributions had been processed as they arrived, logged in separate databases, and never summed. When the total was presented in a single report, several senior delegates read it twice. Rethais read it once. He set it on his desk. He looked at his aide, and his aide looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. The report was 40 pages long. The summary at the front was 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph ended with a sentence that nobody in the room felt like arguing with, though several of them wanted to. It said, "The recently admitted human civilization has, in 11 years of membership, contributed more to shared assembly infrastructure than 4 of the current 7 permanent directorate seats have contributed in the past century." Outside in the dark, the null veil drifted, and in the outer arm the colonies kept working because they always had. On the 9th day, a ship arrived at Concordia Prime's docking ring. It was a human vessel, a mid-sized diplomatic transport, the same class of ship the Earth delegation always used. It docked quietly at Bay 14, which was the human delegation's usual bay, and its arrival was logged in the station's traffic system the way all arrivals were logged. Nothing about it was dramatic. But word moved through the station, the way word always moves through a place where many people are watching for the same thing. Within 20 minutes of the docking log appearing in the system, the corridors near Bay 14 had more foot traffic than usual. Delegates' aides who had business on the other side of the station suddenly found reasons to be closer to that wing. A camera crew from the Terran press service positioned itself near the intersection of corridors 4 and 7, which was the most direct route from Bay 14 to the delegation suites. Ambassador Yara Osai walked off the ship wearing the same jacket she had worn when she left. Her hair was the same. Her pace was the same. If 9 days away had changed anything about her, it did not show on her face. What was different was who met her at the dock. In the ordinary course of business, delegations arriving at Concordia Prime were met by their own staff or by a junior member of the station's administrative team. Protocol was protocol. You were greeted according to your rank, and Earth's rank was 11 years old and had no permanent directorate seat, and sat at a small table on the outer ring of the floor. 3 senior delegates were waiting at Bay 14. Tevari of the Sarathi, wearing her full formal sash. The senior delegate of the Terran, a being called Oros, who had been a member of the Assembly for 60 years and had never once, to anyone's knowledge, personally met a ship at the dock. And an elderly delegate from the Cathari, one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the Assembly, a species so old that their first recorded star journey had happened before humanity had invented writing. The Cathari delegate's name was Vensarath. She moved slowly with the help of a carved walking staff. She was, by her own species' reckoning, the equivalent of 900 years old. She had been observing the assembly since before the station had been built. She looked at Yara Osai when Yara stepped off the ship, and she nodded once deeply, the way her people nodded when they meant it. Yara nodded back. They walked together, the 4 of them, through the corridor and toward the delegation wing. No one spoke much. Kofi and Ananya walked behind. The camera crew got their footage. What happened in the following 48 hours was negotiation, and the details of negotiation are mostly numbers and legal language and long silences in rooms where everyone is deciding how much they are willing to give up. The broad shape of it was this. Earth presented a framework document. It had 12 points. The Sarathi and the Durnai had already seen versions of it. The Cathori elder had asked to review it before anyone else. The framework said the following things, in plain terms. The outer arm colonies were sovereign territory and would continue to expand without requiring assembly approval for settlements within defined human space. The null veil sensor network would be formally integrated into the assembly's defense grid with shared operational status, meaning it could not be suspended unilaterally by either side. Earth would accept 3 seats on the Security Directorate, a body that had previously been closed to species with fewer than 50 years of membership. In return, Earth committed to maintaining the routing data contribution, the medical research partnerships, and the food supply contracts, and agreed to a consultation framework for any new corridor development that significantly affected existing trade lanes. It was not what the Veth had wanted. It was not what the Veth had written the original resolution to produce. The original resolution had been written to keep something small. The framework produced something larger. The vote was held on the 12th day of the session. 178 delegations voted in favor of the Earth framework. 11 voted against. The Veth hegemony abstained. In the Assembly's 600 years of recorded proceedings, there had been loud votes and quiet votes and votes that changed the borders of civilizations. The Veth abstention was not recorded as dramatic in the official minutes. It was logged as an abstention like any other abstention, a neutral non-vote that carried no formal weight. But everyone in the room understood what it meant. The Veth hegemony had come to the session expecting to finish a small piece of procedural business and leave. They were leaving the session having watched a species they had dismissed restructure their own position in galactic politics in 9 days, without raising a weapon, without issuing a threat, without doing anything except walking out of a room and waiting. Councillor Rethais was not present for the vote. He had returned to Veth home space 2 days earlier. The formal record listed it as a prior commitment. Yara Os signed the framework document at a table in the center of the assembly floor. She used a pen she had brought from home, a physical pen, a habit she had kept since law school when a professor had told her that the best contracts are the ones you remember signing. She signed her name clearly, set the pen down, and looked up. The hall was quiet the way a room is quiet when everyone in it is paying attention. The delegates on the floor, the observers in the tiers, the press cameras in their fixed positions. Vensarath of the Cathari, seated in the elder delegates' row, watching with the patience of someone who had watched a great many things. Yara looked at all of them, no expression that was easy to name, not triumph, not relief, something steadier than either. She nodded once. Later that evening in her suite, she wrote a message home. She kept it short. She said the vote had gone through. She said she would be home in 3 weeks. She said the outer arm settlements could continue with the next phase of construction, and to please pass that on to the colony administrators as soon as possible, because they had been waiting and they deserved to know first. She did not mention Rethais. She did not mention the walkout. She did not mention the 9 days, or the Sarathi relay stations, or the 41% routing figure, or the look on the faces of 300 delegates when they had finally sat down and added up 11 years of numbers. Those things would be in the record. They would be in the reports. They would be in the notes that Ven Sarath of the Cathari wrote that same evening in her private journal, in a language so old that fewer than 200 living beings could read it. The old archivist wrote carefully. She had been keeping these notes since before this station existed. She had written about wars and treaties and the rise and fall of 3 civilizations and the long middle distances of history, where nothing seemed to happen and everything was changing. She wrote about today. She wrote what she had seen. She wrote that she had watched a young species arrive with nothing but work and time, and be told that work and time were not enough, and choose to show the room what enough actually looked like. She wrote that the most dangerous thing in any negotiation was not the one who shouted. It was the one who had been patient for a very long time and finally, quietly, stopped. She closed her journal. Outside the viewport, the dead star glowed faintly red. The station turned. Somewhere past the edge of the maps, past the null veil's drifting boundary in the long stretch of the outer arm, the lights of 1 billion lives moved slowly through the dark. They had work to do. They had always had work to do, and now, at last, no one was going to stop them.